Assalamualaikum and a very good day I bid to everyone present here today. Allow me to introduce myself. So my name is Nur Asni Shahriza binti Abu Hassan, a lecturer from Academy of Language Studies, University Technology Mara, Kedah, and I will be moderating our session for today, inshallah. So today is a special day for all of us because we are going to have an ELC151 Global Learning session. And we are even luckier to have an experienced international speaker with us today who will be sharing his insights, his knowledge, and his experience about writing and understanding creative piece. So, dearest students, make sure you give your 100% attention and focus to get as much information and knowledge as you can. And should you have any doubts or questions, I am very sure our speaker would be more than happy to answer your questions. So now, let me introduce you to our speaker for today, Mr. Travis Senzaki. All right, so Mr. Travis Senzaki is an international educator and author residing in Japan. He was born in the USA, but his high school year abroad in Japan sparked a lifelong love of travel, immersing himself in new cultures and stories. He has since lived and worked abroad in Japan, Afghanistan, Thailand, and has visited 18 other countries for work, study, or for pleasure. Mr. Travis has spent 12 years working in international education in Japan, including international graduate student admissions and student exchange programs. He now oversees and supports all international collaboration for Akita International University, one of Japan's top and most international universities. He is also one of the leading independent experts on the Japanese government Monbukaga Kusho Max Scholarship. He has published 4 non-fiction books, including 3 guides on the Max Scholarship under his full name and 1 fiction novelet, his real passion as T.A. Senzaki. So now, Mr. Travis, let me introduce you to the people who are behind our session for today. This session will not be successful if not by the initiative of Puan Shazliati Ibrahim as the program leader. Pak Shaz, are you there? With the help of Puan Rebecca Harun and also Puan Sharifah Shakila and myself too. And now we have students of University Technology Mara of various programs, but we have students from our classes, BA 111, CAAD 114, and AC 110. Accounting students, art and design students, business administrative students. Okay, Mr. Travis, I hope you are ready. So the session is now yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you especially to Professor Shazliatia Ibrahim, who was my primary coordinator and set up this whole meeting. I'm very pleased and honored to be here to present to all of you today. I'm sorry that I could not be there in person and meet all of you, but I hope that through today's session, I can offer some information and insight into short stories from the perspective of the author and what to look for, what the person writing them is feeling when they write the story, and how that might help you better understand the stories and how to interpret them. So let me see. It looks like I do not have permission to share my screen. Is that the case?
I cannot change the rule. I'm not sure why. So can you share your slides in the chat box, and I'll share on the screen for you? How's that?
Sure, let me do that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Travis.
1 second, please. The PowerPoint version is very large, so I'm going to send you the PDF version.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
That would be a little bit easier for everyone to download. Sorry, it's not letting me put a file in the chat. But I had sent it by email to Professor Shaz earlier, so maybe she has a copy there.
Okay, all right. Kak Shaz, if you're listening, can you share it to my Telegram? Mr. Travis, give us like 2 minutes, yeah?
Of course.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. So I guess while we're waiting for the slides, I can just start with a little bit of an introduction.
Yes, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
She generously gave my introduction earlier, but my name is Travis Senzaki. I was born and raised in America, but when I was in my 3rd year of high school, I studied abroad in Japan. And before I went to study abroad in Japan, I knew almost nothing about the country. But going out to live in a new culture, first in Japan and then in a few other countries, really taught me a lot about myself. And it was through that experience first of studying abroad that made me think about becoming a writer. So I had always been an avid reader, but I never really thought that I could write until I had that experience. So throughout today's talk, first of all, I want to give you a little bit of background about myself because, oh, here we go, maybe slide. My experiences are what contributed to the stories I write or why I want to write stories. So knowing some of that background could be helpful for you. Excellent. Thank you for the slides. Then, so could you go to the next slide, please? So then I'll share a little bit about living in Japan, my journey from being a reader of stories to a writer of stories. And then I'll talk about short stories, how to look at them from the writer's perspective, and how that might be able to help you. So next slide, please. One more, please. Okay. So as I had planned to be able to show you myself on video and wave, so I'm afraid I didn't have a picture in here, but I will try to fix that later. But as you said, my current job is in international education. So I work at Akita International University in Japan. It is a university where everything is taught in English, and we require all of our students to study abroad for 1 year. And that is the reason I came to work here, because I believe in studying abroad, or at the very least, because I know not everybody can study abroad. I believe it is very important to encounter other cultures, to learn about people from different backgrounds, and to use that experience and understanding to question yourself. Because I think it is only by learning about something different, a different culture, a different way of thinking, that we really come to understand our own selves. So that is why I got into this career field. And of course, I'm very passionate about writing. It says here, I'm a blogger. So I started writing a blog online, just sharing my experiences living in Japan, sharing information I thought could be useful to other people. But then that grew into books, and then I always wanted to write fiction. So finally, I wrote the one fiction novelette. But why only one? Why only one? Because I finished that novelette 3 days before my third daughter was born. And since then, having 3 kids and a full-time job keeps me very, very busy. So I haven't been able to finish much more since, but I'm still working and hope to have more soon. Next slide, please. And one more. So as an author, as someone who's aspiring to become a writer, one thing we're told often is write what you know. But I think this piece of advice is very dangerous when it is misinterpreted. So let me give you an example. Does everybody know the story of Harry Potter? I think that's internationally well-known, famous. Okay, so I don't think that J.K. Rowling knew about flying on a broomstick. I don't think she knew about playing sports in midair, but she invented the game of Quidditch in Harry Potter, and she described it in a way that everybody who read that could understand what it felt like to be flying through the air or to almost fall off your broom, or the moment of triumph when they win. So write what you know is not necessarily about the actual experience, but I think it is about the emotional experience. So maybe Miss Rowling never flew on a broom, but she might have been in a sports competition where there was a lot of pressure on her, and she was the one to try to win, make the scoring goal or win the match. So she knew what that emotion was like. Maybe she'd also had experience driving a car around a turn quickly, or being in an airplane that got hit by turbulence. And so she knew how to describe what it felt like to be jostled in the air. So when I look at the term write what you know, like I said, I think it is about the emotional experience. And so that is why throughout my life, I have tried to seek out new experiences, seek out new cultures, new ways of thinking, so that I can incorporate those into my writing as part of what I know. And my novelette is a fantasy novel, so I don't have to know all of the details about how to do magic. I can make them up. You can always do research. You can always make things up when it comes to those details, but having the emotional core is what matters. Next slide, please. All right. So I grew up on a small island. I lived in a town of 5,000 people. My island had a total of 25,000 who lived there throughout the year. But in the summer, it was a tourist town, so the population went up to about 125,000. Still quite small in many contexts. But it was a very sheltered life. I interacted mostly with the same people. And I was shy. I was not the person out. I was not the sports star. I was not the life of the party. So I spent a lot of time reading books. Books were my escape. That was my adventure, living in this small town. And by the way, it is the town where the movie Jaws was filmed. So I lived by the beach, but even though Jaws was not real, there was always the fear of going in the water a little bit because of the sharks. If you watch that movie, I know it's very old now, but you'll see that is actually the town where I grew up. And it is very similar to that, even now. So books were my escape. I read a lot of fantasy. I read a lot of science fiction stories where an average person became a hero and had great adventures. And I loved that experience. So when I had the opportunity in high school, a program came around recruiting students for study abroad. They said, you can go 1 year somewhere in the world. You don't know where. I signed up because I wanted that adventure and I wanted to make my own story. And that is how I initially ended up in Japan. Next slide, please. Living in other cultures, experiencing other ways of life has been my route to story. And this is something that I reflect or try to reflect in everything I write. So my first experience was going to Japan. I had spent almost all of my life on this small island. Maybe took a few vacations to see family in other places. But from there to go all the way to the other side of the world, and I knew very little about Japan. It wasn't even my first choice, to be honest with you. It was my 7th choice study abroad destination. But before I went, one of my parents' friends gave me a book called The Ugly American. No, that is not me. But The Ugly American is a story of, it's a fictional story, but it's a story about how the American Foreign Service, particularly in Southeast Asia, ignored the local culture and just tried to be American all the time and impose their will and ignore everything else. And that is why they failed. So from reading this book before I left, it was an important lesson for me to learn to adapt myself to the local culture, to study the local culture, and to get to know that environment. But like I said, Japan was my 7th choice. I did not know very much about the country. I did not know the language when I went there. I wasn't prepared to go there. And so I had a lot of experiences, and the 2 terms I have here in the middle of the slide, fish out of water and naive newcomer. These are tropes from stories. So a fish out of water is a trope where you take somebody who might be very used to their own home environment. Maybe they're a natural at something. And then you put them in a completely different environment where they don't know anything and they have to adapt and they have to go from nothing to success. That was my experience. And the naive newcomer is also a character you see in stories. The naive newcomer is someone who is there so that you can explain things. Okay. In this presentation, I am doing what we call an info dump. In stories, an info dump is a bad thing. It's when we start the story by telling you, here is everything you need to know before the story actually gets started. It's boring. A lot of people will give up reading at that point. But the naive newcomer is a character in the story who knows nothing. And so the other characters, as they go along, can explain things to the newcomer little by little, and they introduce information through the story. That's a better way to do it, and that was my experience. So I have here on the slide 2 pictures. And these are 2 pictures that represent an interesting cultural experience I had in my first week in Japan. So I was staying with a host family, and they owned a bakery. So during the day, I spent time just sitting in the bakery. And one of the waitresses came up to me and asked, she saw I was a little bit lonely, still trying to adjust, still jet lagged. She asked, do you like tacos? Do you like taco? And I'm thinking about the picture on the top here, Mexican food, tacos. Yes, I love tacos. I would love to have some food that I'm used to from back home. And so I was very enthusiastic. I said yes. But what she brought out was the bottom picture. Because in Japanese, taco means octopus. So instead of ground beef with salsa and cheese, I got balls of dough with octopus in them. I did not like that kind of taco very much. So this is just one example of questioning your assumptions. You might think you know something until you're encountered with it. And that's something I like to put in my stories too. When a character thinks they have everything figured out, but it's based on a false assumption. This is a very common trope in stories, something I like to use. When the character has what we call a mistaken assumption. They think the world operates one way, but it's really different. And that was an experience that I got from study abroad. It also made me question and think about my lifestyle, my home country, my home culture, and better understand that so I can use those elements as well. Next slide, please. Oh. Hello? Can everybody see the slides?
Sorry about that. I was having problem with the connection just now. So are you
Okay.
still on this slide, Mr. Travis? Next one?
Next slide, please. I had just said next slide when the connection broke. So
Okay, all right. Is it this one?
yes.
All right.
So during the introduction, she had explained where I have lived, visited, and traveled. So I was born in the US. I lived in Japan twice, once as a student and now as a working adult. And those are two very different experiences. Within the US, I've lived in Hawaii, which is very different culture from the mainland of the USA. I also spent a few months living in Afghanistan, where I was working there, and I lived in Thailand for a year. But I've highlighted, and you can see here that unfortunately, so far, I've only been to Malaysia for work. So most of what I have seen of Malaysia has been the inside of conference halls. Although I did get to tour one university there. I hope to go back and maybe meet all of you. But I have circled Thailand here because I visited Thailand first as a student for 1 week, and then traveled there on my own on vacation, and finally moved there. And visiting a culture and living in a culture give you two very different perspectives. So I want to talk about that briefly on the next slide, please. So the top left picture is from when I first visited Thailand. You can see at the time I was in the US Air Force and we were visiting the Thai Air Force. So they took us on a guided tour of the country. Everywhere we went, we had a guide. They were explaining things to us, but we saw a set number of things they wanted us to see. But that was very informative. They explained some of the famous temples there. They took us to the palace and explained the history. But then I went back several years later and lived there for a year, teaching English at a Thai high school. And the bottom right picture is me with the other English teachers on a school trip. And living there, being able to move around freely, I saw a very different side of Thailand. I got to interact with local people. I got to interact with my students and see what their day-to-day life was like. I got to go to local markets and upscale shopping centers and see the difference. I ate at nice restaurants and I ate at food stands and sometimes got sick because I wasn't used to it. But living there gave me a very different and a much richer perspective of the culture and the stories that I could understand from the people I met there. And I have a few other examples on the next slides of other places I visited. Move, next slide, please. Okay, so these are places I visited in China, Tibet, and the Czech Republic. But in each case, I was only there for a few days. I got to see some sights. So traveling to these kinds of places informed my sense of setting. So I can use what I knew about the Great Wall of China and how it was built in a story. I can use the structure of the temples and palaces from Tibet and from Czech Republic, the cathedrals. So these kinds of experiences gave me some knowledge, gave me some background for background setting, maybe for some characters' backgrounds as well. Next slide, please. And these are places I've lived. So the bottom left picture is Hawaii, and that is Queen Liliuokalani Palace, because Hawaii was formerly an independent country. And then the top right picture is from Afghanistan, where I was participating in a local leadership summit. But in these cases, living in the countries, I got to know the people better. I had more time to explore the history and the stories, the conflicts they had experienced, the ways of life, the ways of thinking. So all of these experiences of other cultures are what feed into my stories and what I use as material. Next slide, please. And there's also, even if you don't travel around the world, there are cultures within cultures that are worth exploring. These are worth having this experience to feed into your own story and to help understand others. So I mentioned I grew up on a small island. It is called Martha's Vineyard. And there are two very different sides to Martha's Vineyard. Both of the pictures on the right here are houses from that island. The top house looks like maybe one family lives there. It's quite small. And that is the kind of house that the people who live on Martha's Vineyard year-round live in. But the bottom house, you can see, is a mansion. It wouldn't surprise me if that house had 20 bedrooms, multiple kitchens. And that is where some of the summer tourists live. Actually, I think that might be the house that former President Obama stayed in. These are both parts of Martha's Vineyard, but they're two very different cultures. There are the people like my family who lived there all year, who worked there. And there are people who just, the rich tourists who came only during the summer and had their time there. So there are different ways of thinking, different ways of living. And being in that environment too, seeing those differences can be very valuable. The other examples I have there of the university and the military are other cultures where I've lived and seen that the experience from one person's perspective is very different from the experience from another person. You are all in university now. And when I was a university student, actually, when I was a university student, I didn't even think about the university administrative staff. I never really thought about what does the registrar do? What is their job like? Of course, I thought about the teachers. But later, now, I became a university staff member. And I see everything that happens in the background that makes the student's education possible. So seeing something I thought I knew from a different perspective gave me a new way to look at it. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, well, while we're waiting for that. So why did I tell you this? Why did I tell you about all of my travels and exploring other cultures? It is not to brag. It is to show this was me This was my attempt to write what I know. Every time I travel somewhere, every time I interact with somebody from a new culture or perspective. Ah, hello, can you see me now? Thank you. That is an opportunity for me to learn a new story. It is an opportunity to learn a new way of thinking, and that's something I can bring into future stories. Let me see. I think I can actually share the slides directly now. So let me do that. So I'm not sure. Oops. Trying to get the sharing function here. Okay. Looks like I may be able to send you a file, but I don't know if I can.
Hello, Mr. Travis.
Yes.
Okay, sorry again. It's the connection. I'm really, really sorry. Okay, can you share now your slides?
Ah, yes, yes. It looks like everything is okay.
All right.
Can everyone see this now?
Yes, I can. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
All right. So thank you, and my apologies to all of the students about how long it's taken me to figure this out.
Thank you very much.
So in my case, I just wanted to share my stories come from my travels, come from the people I have met, come from the experiences I have had. So that for me is writing what I know, those emotional experiences, those connections. You don't necessarily have to travel for this, but you do have to be deliberate in the way that you interact with the world to get that background. I'll try to go a little bit quickly through the next section so we can get to the short stories part because we lost a little bit of time. But now I am living in Japan, where I've been since 2011. So I've been here just over 13 years. And it is in Japan that I first started really writing. And I'll skip to the bottom of this one, opportunity and advantage. This is something I want to share with you too. Why did I start writing in Japan? Why did I start writing nonfiction at first? It was because I had an opportunity. I had an unfair advantage because I could speak and read Japanese, but a lot of the things that I wanted to do as a foreign resident in Japan, the information was only available in Japanese. There was not so much information available in English. So I could read the Japanese information and then share it with everybody in easy to understand English. And that is how I started. So all of you now are studying English in this class. So maybe you'll find an area that you are passionate about, that you want to share and to talk about, but the information is mostly in English, and you want to share it with an audience who doesn't speak English as well as you do. You have that unfair advantage of having a second language, and with a language, a separate way of thinking about things. You can use that if you are interested in starting writing too. So these are just some of the places I visited in Japan. I previously lived in Kyoto when I first moved here. But this is mostly the kinds of places you go as a tourist. They are great places to see, to have some inspiration for designing settings, designing areas, world building. I've also got to participate in different activities living here. that I would not have as a tourist. So in the picture on the left, this is from the summit of Mount Fuji. This is the second time I climbed Mount Fuji. The first time was as a student, and you can see I've got a stick there in my hand. And you buy this stick when you first start on the mountain. And every station you make it, you can pay a little bit of money and they'll put a stamp on the stick, a brand for that station. So my goal was to get all of them before I got to the top. And I did this for the first time when I was an exchange student in Japan in high school. But I missed one. I missed one station because it was the station where we stayed overnight. And we got there at night. And I said, I'll get the stamp in the morning. I'm too tired. Well, in the morning, by the time we left, they weren't doing the stamps yet. And so I couldn't get it. So when I went back, after moving back to Japan, I was determined. I wanted to get that missing stamp. But in the meantime, they'd closed that station. They'd knocked it down. And so there was no more station for me to get a stamp. And I never could complete that stick. But that was an experience I had because I lived here. And in the right, this is from a festival called Gion Matsuri in Kyoto. And about 60 of us were pulling this giant float through the streets of Kyoto, participating in this annual festival. Just getting to understand the history and the tradition and being able to participate in these festivals was also hugely inspiring. So I started, like I said, using my knowledge of Japanese to find information that's only available in Japanese and provide it in English. That was my unfair advantage. I started with the blog, and the first book there on the top, I had started blogging about my experience trying to get a spouse visa for Japan, because it's very difficult and a lot of the information was only available clearly in Japanese at the time. So for other people like me, other international visitors, it was very difficult. So I shared that first in a blog and then in a book. Then my first job at a Japanese university was to help receive applications for the MEC scholarship. And this is a scholarship that provides full tuition and a living stipend for your entire graduate degree. So it's very competitive. But again, a lot of the information that was available was only available in Japanese, even though you can apply entirely in English. So after I finished that job, I wanted to share everything I knew about that scholarship. And so I wrote the books below to try to share that information with other applicants. And one of my reasons for writing the books, was it helps me learn more. If I'm writing just a simple blog post on my website, then it's just what I think. It's just what I already know. But if I'm going to write a book, I want to make sure it's the best quality. I want to make sure it has the best information. And so that helped encourage me to do more research. So a lot of times, in my case, it is nonfiction. These are guidebooks. But a lot of authors write to understand what they think or what they know. Through writing, that's how we come to understand ourselves better. And that is a concept that will tie into the fiction and the short stories that I'll cover momentarily. So I started writing, my first long writing was writing stories about living in Japan when I was an exchange student. And I would write a letter home every week by email to everybody I knew about my experiences. And I really enjoyed stories. I really enjoyed reading. And so when I got to university, I did not major in English because I'll be honest with you, I hated English class. English class was all about how to analyze stories. We look at the similes, We're going to look at the language use. We're going to look at the description. I wanted stories to be entertaining. I wanted stories to be informative. And I actually found more stories like that in history. And so I majored in history. Then, when I got into graduate school, I read a lot of esoteric books, a lot of books on very narrow research focuses. And they told me in graduate school, most academic books are called monograms. Why is it called a monogram? Mono means one. And they told me it's called a monogram because only one person is ever going to read it. There are so many interesting ideas in these research books, but they're written for academics. They're written in a way that's difficult to understand. And so I wanted to take these concepts and put them into fiction so that more people could come into contact with these cool ideas that I was finding in my research. So I'll be honest with you, I attempted a lot of novels. I've written several that I will call trunk novels. I finished them. They were no good. I put them in a trunk. They will never see the light of day. Most authors have a collection of these, but it is part of learning. And the first time I did this was something called NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, which is November of each year. And the objective of this event is to write 50,000 words in 1 month. And there's online communities, there's people encouraging one another every day. So doing that, I was able to finish it. That was the first novel I ever finished, but again, not so good. And over the years, I've bought quite a few writing advice books to try to help get better. Each time I read, or each time I finish a book, I look at what was wrong, what I need to do better, what I can learn more. And these are just a few of those books. But I want to draw attention to the 4 in the top row here, because these ones I will be referring to a little bit later on. The top 4 are the ones I have found most useful in my writing journey. So that is how to write short stories and use them to further your writing career. And traditionally, authors who wanted to go into writing full-length novels would start with short stories. And I'll tell you why in just a little bit, but short stories are a very important technical step. Story Genius by Lisa Cron was the book I read right before I wrote Brayek the Apprentice, which is my novelette. So that was the book. What I learned from that book helped inform the way I wrote. And then The Anatomy of Genres and The Anatomy of Story. They're not necessarily specifically about short stories, but they are about the form of story and how to make an entertaining story. Yes. Just the process I've gone through. My one success in publishing a book is Brayek the Apprentice here. But even though I call it a success, in many ways, there were a lot of failures involved. And one of those failures is actually the cover. Because the cover shows a scene that happens in the book, but it's not very informative, it's not very inspiring. And if you haven't read the book, it probably doesn't mean anything, which is not what a cover is supposed to do. All right, so sorry that was a long introduction, but I want to get into the start of what today's lesson, today's course was supposed to be about, which is short stories. And like I said, I hated English class. I did not enjoy analyzing stories and breaking them down. That's not my area of expertise. I wanted stories to entertain. I wanted stories to be exciting. And so I want to talk to you today about why we write stories, why the author writes stories, what's going through our heads, what kind of things, at least some of us, think about as we are preparing to write. So first, what is a short story? This is from the website of the Alliance of Independent Authors about what the length of a story is. So here it says a short story is 1,000 to 7,500 words. Some definitions will have it shorter, some will have it longer. My book, Break, it falls into the category of a novelette, but I like to joke that because it's epic fantasy, and epic fantasy novels tend to be over 120,000 words, compared to a normal novel, it's really a short story. So why do we write short stories? I mentioned the book by James Scott Bell earlier. I love long novels. I love series of novels. So why write something short? Well, it forces us to be more creative. Limits, constraints actually help encourage creativity. So if I think I only have 7,500 words to express this concept, to express this story, it makes me think in a different way of what words I'm going to use, how I'm going to set the setting to make it clear in as few words as possible. So it's an excellent way to go through really training about how to get better at writing. So this is something, as you're reading short stories in the future, I want to encourage you to think about. Look at the writing and ask yourself, what does this writing, what is this description, what does this dialogue express in a short amount of time that could have taken much longer? Or if you're looking at a full-length novel, maybe you can think about, how would I have taken this whole long scene and compressed it down to get the essence, the important point out, the entertaining point out, shorter? So short stories are a way to practice that. So another way to look at short stories is or different lengths of stories, sorry, is what do they cover? So not just the word count, but so a novel can cover the story of a person's entire life or an entire era, multiple lives. It can be very complex. I mentioned a novel can be as short as 40,000 words, and some romance novels typically are that short. But then you get to epic fantasy novels where they can be 200,000 words, 250,000 words, and that allows for a much more complex story. As you get to shorter and shorter forms, then you can only really tell the story of a single character or a single event. And for a short story, this comes from James Scott Bell from that book I mentioned earlier. The short story is about the fallout of one shattering moment. It should be one moment. And really, we try to tell the story, decide how long the story is going to be based on the idea. So if it is a story of a moment, it becomes a short story. In my book, Break, The Apprentice, the shattering moment comes at the end, but really it can come anywhere in the story. Something can happen at the very beginning and we see the character reacting to it. And there can be a build-up, shattering moment, and then follow-out if it's in the middle. It can be at the very end, like it was in my story. But one interesting thing he says is that the shattering moment doesn't necessarily have to be in the story. So that's one thing to look at for short stories, is what you see on the page isn't necessarily the entire story. It could be a reaction to something that happened before the story began or after the story ends, where it's a build-up, but we never see the shattering moment. We never see how the characters react. It's left to us. It's left to the reader to think about that. But regardless of the length, a short story must be a satisfying story. And this is one thing I always look for: enjoyment. I always look for entertainment in my stories. But it must be a full, satisfying story with a beginning, a middle, and end. It must have a conflict, must have an engaging character, plot, and in most cases will have a theme as well. So again, this forces us to be very economical and very careful with word selection and description. I just want to mention this briefly as another way to understand stories, and because it's going to lead into what I'm about to describe when I talk about how we create stories. There are two primary schools of thinking about how to write, and they're commonly called plotting and pantsing. I am a plotter. I think about the entire story beforehand. I know my characters. Before I start writing, I know how it's going to end. This chart on the right-hand side here comes from Story Genius. And this is the outline format I used to write Brayek, the Apprentice. For each scene, I wrote out what happens in the scene. Okay. What are the effects of what happened in the scene? Why does it matter to the character? And what they realize from it. So scene by scene, very, very detailed breakdown. But other authors are very successful at what we call pantsing. And I'm aware that's an American term, but the American term is right by the seat of your pants. So basically, it comes from flying. When I was in the Air Force, we talked about pilots who would fly by the seat of their pants. Basically, that is where you're touching the airplane. And so you're sensing everything and just reacting as you go. So it is less planned and more in the moment. I know that, I guess in Malaysia, you probably use more British English. And yes, the British English speakers don't like to use the term pantsing because in American English, pants refers to trousers. Okay, it's nothing, yeah, I know it's different in British English. So British English speakers like to call this discovery writing. You discover the story as you are writing. But from an American perspective, we actually value people who write by the seat of their pants or fly by the seat of their pants. It's a compliment. And so I've used that term. Okay. So I want to talk about not how to break down a short story, not how to break down and analyze a story, but how to build one, how to write one from an author's perspective. And hopefully that will help you when you look at short stories or long stories in the future. Because story is a story. It might be short, it might be economical, it might be very long, but they should essentially have a lot of the same elements. So that's what I want to go through. And this is just my approach. This is just one way of writing stories, but I've borrowed this from a few of those books that I flashed up on screen earlier. So in my case, I like to start my stories with a theme, an idea. What is the story about? What is going to happen? Not necessarily what is going to happen, but what is the concept I want to explore? So in the story Brayek the Apprentice, it is about the main character confronting the fact that he has been brought up, raised his entire life to think that if you just do what the system asks of you, you will have the good life. If you do what you are told, if you progress according to the steps that everyone has told you, then things will go well. But that is not the case. And he has blindly followed a system and comes to a realization that things are not the way he understood. That was my idea that I wanted to explore, was following a system. So that's a very general idea. So from there, we come up with the premise. And the premise, to borrow the words of John Truby, is the simplest possible statement of character and plot. So John Truby gives the example of Star Wars, the original movie, where his statement of premise is a young warrior uses his developing abilities to take down an evil empire. Very simple. You've got the character, you've got the plot. So start with that, and that gives you the very basic part of the story. We have the theme, the idea we want to explore, which is, in my case, putting your faith in the system. And the premise, in my case, is a young artificer wants to impress his master by creating a new device. So premise is he's building something new that's never been seen before, and his hope is to impress somebody and get advancement. So within the premise, we have the seeds of the conflict. Okay, things aren't going to go the way that your hero wants them to go, because if they do, it's not a story. If everything goes nicely and nobody gets into an argument, there's no fights, nothing goes wrong, I'm sorry, but it's somewhat boring. Okay? Stories come from conflict. They come from people challenging something, overcoming something, maybe finding love where they couldn't before. Okay? So what is the conflict? Within that premise, who fights who over what? And then the setting, or world building in some cases. This is particularly for a short story. You don't have very much time to get into describing the setting, describing the environment. So what purpose does the setting serve? For me, it is to provide a background coloring that will show you the emotions of the character. So I borrow a lot from the travels I described earlier. What sort of emotions did I feel when I went to different places? And I try to use that to paint a background picture for my character to act against. And I have in the bottom description with a question mark, because in a short story particularly, I think description should be very sparing, just the minimum to get out enough for you, the reader, to make a mental picture of what's going on. There are other writers who go into very, very deep detail on description, down to what is each character wearing, what color are the lamps, how many chairs are there in the room. Oh, okay. I see someone has raised a question, raised a hand. Do you have a question? I'm not sure I know.
Questions? I think you can just continue, Mr.
Okay.
Travis.
Okay. So, sorry. So this is again John Truby, and when I showed the list of books earlier, 2 of them were by him, but this is from the book The Anatomy of Story, and it says this is about developing the theme story. Write something that may change your life. So when I go into writing a story, and I think many other authors too, one thing we're looking for is I want to explore a concept that could change my life. It might not eventually, but something that is that important to me. So I mentioned that my story, Brayek, was about challenging the system. He thought that if he just lived his life according to the system, everything would work out well. And you saw from my background that I had some time in the military, in the US Air Force. And I thought if I just did my job there, then I would have a better life, get promoted, have a good career. But that was not the case. I encountered some experiences there that were not pleasant, that were not what I expected. And so I had to change careers. But that was where the idea of wanting to explore whether the system is going to help you or not came from. So when you're looking at a story, one thing to look at, whether a short story or something longer, is what idea is the writer exploring? What is the concept? What is the fundamental idea? And the theme of a story is often, what is the writer's perspective of how to live in the world? What is the right way to live? So this is what we call a moral argument. And when I write a story, that is what I'm looking for. Through the character's actions, I'm not going to come out at the end and say, you should live like this. This is the right way to be. No, I want you to see through the character's actions and what happens to them, the consequences, what I think is the right way to deal with the central theme idea. And most characters, in order to show this, will start with a moral flaw. Okay? There's something they need to overcome about themselves. And towards the end of the story, they will need to make a choice, whether to continue in their flawed ways or to embrace a new way. And that is one way we can show the theme. So if you see any of those indicators, a character who at the end has to choose between two difficult paths, that is one way you can see what theme the author might be trying to express. Right. And next we go on to the premise. You mentioned this is the simplest way to state the character and the plot. And the key to the premise is that once you have the theme, you'll try to find the best possible story within that theme. Something that's going to be entertaining to the reader and also explain that moral argument. And this is usually done through a character who has a weakness or a moral flaw that they are struggling to overcome. So we talk about rising and falling actions in a story. A character, or also a try-fail cycle, is another way to say it. The character will come against a challenge, and in the beginning, because they have a weakness or they have a flaw, they will fail. And they will try again. And maybe this time, even though they have the weakness, they succeed and they think they're on the right way, but then they have another challenge and fail. And it is only in the end, when they overcome their own weakness, or what it is that's holding them back, that they succeed. So you can kind of see this shape in, gesturing the wrong direction. You can see the shape in stories as you go through them. That is another way to see what action the author is trying to portray. So typically we have for a short story, it's going to be one main character. They will have a need or a desire, or both. Oftentimes what a character needs to become a better person is not necessarily what they think they want. So the need and desire can be two different things. And from the author's perspective, we tried to set it up so that they are two different things. So a character, Harry Potter might want to learn how to fly a broom, to play Quidditch, but what he needs is to become confident in himself and to feel like he belongs to something. So sometimes the desire and the need will conflict, or sometimes they will support one another. I mentioned most characters will have a weakness or a flaw. Going back to the example of Harry, his weakness is that he didn't or he grew up not even knowing about the world of magic. And so he is behind all of his other classmates when it comes to understanding and use. And that comes up a lot during the series. And we also need a reason to care about the character. You can have a very interesting theme and premise, but if your character is boring and nobody cares about them, they won't read the story. So we often try to have some way to make you interested in the character or care, show something, maybe a question about them, a mystery that you want to know, or show them in a difficult situation overcoming it so that you sympathize with them. You will often find one of those elements towards the start of the story as a way to help the reader care and understand the character. I won't go through all of these, but when you tell your story, the plot or the genre you choose also helps determine what kind of story it is. So depending on what kind of idea you want to express, different types of genres make different sense. But yeah, I won't go through each of these in detail yet. And finally, the next step is to build the character's opponent. The person they are competing with, the person or the thing that is holding them back. And one way to do this is to have the character and the opponent should be competing over something. So often they want the same thing. What? The same thing. But if we go back to Harry Potter, okay, Harry and Voldemort, it doesn't look like they want the same thing. Voldemort wants to kill Harry, which is not really what Harry wants. But what they want, what both of them want on a grand scale, is to shape the relationship between magic users and muggles, to define how their world will work. Will they be working together, or will they be in conflict or slavery? So that is what they are competing over. We think about it that way, start with that common goal. Then all of the sub goals, like, okay, well, the one way that Voldemort can get what he wants is, to kill Harry, then he wins the competition. You can see the plot points follow from there. And the opponent should also be the person who is best able to attack the character's weakness. So again, Harry Potter has very little knowledge of magic when he starts out. He doesn't know the magic world, but Voldemort does. He has powerful followers. And so he can constantly attack Harry in his weakness in magic or his lack of connection throughout the story. And that forces Harry to get stronger and to grow and to overcome. And I do mention here that your opponent does not necessarily have to be a character, does not have to be a person or an animal. I've read stories where the opponent was nature, was the environment the character found themselves into. And that's common in survival stories. I mentioned earlier the setting. I like to use the setting as a way to hint at the emotion that I want the reader to feel. So oftentimes, if it's a depressing scene, it'll be dark. Or if the character is depressed, they will only notice the dark things. One way I practice this, and something you might be able to see in stories, is go into an area and go into a new place and think, how would I observe this if I was feeling excited and giddy? How would I observe this place if I was feeling suspicious? If I was feeling sad? What are the details I would notice? Because you can observe the same space, the same setting, different ways, depending on how you feel. And so when I describe the setting, when I decide how to describe the settings in a story, I am trying to do that based on what I want you to understand about the character's emotions. And I haven't done this in any of my books, but or my stories, but the setting itself can be a character. And you'll see that in stories like haunted house stories, where the setting has a will of its own. And finally, description. There are a range of where you can go in descriptions. Sparse prose means using very, very little description, the minimum amount necessary. Or on the other side of the spectrum, we have what we call purple prose, where you are describing every last detail. For short stories, the description is usually very brief, it's very sparse. That is also how I prefer to write, that's just a matter of personal preference. When I read a story with long descriptions, I just skip them. And so I don't include them when I write. One exception to that is there are short stories, a type of short stories called vignettes, which are supposed to show a single scene in very great detail. And so in that case, there is quite a lot of description. Okay, we don't have quite as much time as I had originally planned. I talked too long, I'm sorry about that. But what I wanted to do, instead of just having this be a one-way lecture, is I wanted to give you an opportunity to think about stories that you like and try to think about some of these elements. Look at them as if you were writing them to see how you can look at the story. So, okay, it says group exercise here, but you can do this individually. I know many of you are joining this class individually from your own computer. That's fine. If several of you are gathered around using one computer, you can do it as a group. Either one is okay. So what I want to ask you to do, and we'll do this for about, I think we only have about 20 minutes left. So we'll do this for about 10 minutes. I'll give you 10 minutes to work on this. Choose one story, and then I want you to answer these questions here. And I'm going to give you a link to a Google Sheet where you can type in the answers. So the questions will be there. But if you were writing the story, what do you think the story is about? Who is the main character? What do they want and need? What is preventing them from getting what they want? What is their weakness? What is the genre? What does the setting tell you about the character? And finally, if you were to change one thing about the story, what would it be? Okay. I realize we don't have a whole lot of time, and so probably can't get to all of these. But let's see what I can. I'm going to send you a link in the chat to a Google Sheet where you can type the answers. And the sheet is color-coded. Okay, so the green questions are the easiest ones, then the yellow, and then the red. So maybe start with the easier ones. And then if you have time, you can fill out the rest. So each of you can just take a line in this sheet and start filling in. And then in the end, I'll try to bring it back together and talk about some of the answers and expand on those. So can everybody access the Google Sheet? If you have any issues with it, please send a chat or a message or something like that. And I can follow up. I have filled in one.
Thank you, Mr. Travis. Okay, they cannot unmute themselves, so I'm figuring out how to, maybe I'll just, unmute them one by one. Okay, so Ahmad Fakri Aina, can you access the link that Mr. Travis shared with us?
Yes.
Okay, good. So it seems that they can access the link, Mr. Travis.
Okay, I see, looks like several people have already opened it up.
All right.
So hopefully they can access and type. But
Okay.
I'll give you, so we'll go until 10 minutes till the hour, and then I'll bring it back together and follow up.
Yeah, Philip.
Hmm? I think if one person is trying to type in a cell, it will probably become gray, and so that other people can't type in it. So please try to choose a different row from everybody else. And I guess I should say it doesn't necessarily have to be a short story or a story in English. I think you can, hopefully you can find the same elements in all stories. So if you haven't read very many short stories, that's fine. Okay, about another 5 minutes. I see some good answers coming in. Maybe because of my example, but I see a lot of Disney stories. That's good. Disney and Pixar are very good at story structure. Okay, I know I didn't give you very much time for this exercise, and it may have been very challenging given kind of the short introduction and explanation. but I saw several of you had some great answers in there. And I want to say for this exercise, there are no wrong answers. Because one important thing to think about with stories is I explained to you in the first half of today's lecture what I bring to the story as an author, what informs my writing, what informs how I approach stories. And different authors are going to, of course, have different approaches. They're going to have different backgrounds. These stories are going to come from entirely different cultures and time periods. But that's only half of it. The other half of the story is what the reader brings. And so all of you, as you go through these stories, you might see them a little bit differently from your classmates. You might see them differently from how the author may have originally intended it. And that's fine. Because one of the functions of story, I think, is that stories help teach us how to live. I mentioned earlier talking about exploring a concept, write about something that's going to change your life. Explore a concept that is meaningful to you. Well, something that's meaningful to me as an author is probably meaningful to the reader, but maybe in a different way. So thinking about that, I think is a very valuable way to get some value out of stories. And even though one of my primary goals for stories is that they must be entertaining, they must be enjoyable, but they should also leave you with something to think about afterwards. And some of you got to the more difficult questions at the end, but I want to highlight, kind of related to the comment I just made. Sorry to pick on some person individually, but Shakila, who wrote about The Room, she mentioned that, what is the story world? What does the world tell you about the characters? Even though it's fictional, kidnapping happens in real life. And it can lead to the victims being extremely dissociated with the realities of life and freedom. And I think that's an excellent point, and something that I wish I had made, is that by experiencing these stories through the lens of the characters, you get to live that experience too. You get to live it as the reader, I get to live it as the writer, even though it might not be something I've ever encountered in my life. So I think that's a great way of explaining what is one of the important purposes of story. Thank you. And some of you are still working on this. Sorry, that's not the only great answer. That was just the first one I saw that really highlighted the point I was trying to make. But very good job thinking about these stories, thinking about what they might have meant to the writer and what they mean to you. No, we don't. We do not have much time left, but I wanted to give you kind of a final message and then take any questions. I think even though students can't unmute themselves, I think you can still ask questions in the chat. So if you have questions, I'll take those at the end. But I've talked today about stories from my perspective as a writer, but being a writer is just one form of being a creator. And the world for creators, for makers, has changed so much since I first left my small town to become an exchange student. Now you have access to so many different tools. You have access to different training and resources. I didn't have YouTube growing up that I could look. Now I can go to YouTube and study how to do something very quickly. I can go online and find a recipe. But before, I would have to go to the library and check out a cookbook. So the tools are there for you to do the research and to learn anything you want about how to make new things, how to inspire yourself to be a creator. And that is true for writing, for music, for art. You have unprecedented access now through the internet and through the resources that are available to pursue whatever sort of creation, whatever sort of life makes you happy and what you can contribute to the world. So I encourage you to think about that. And even though this is a very exciting and dynamic time for the development of artificial intelligence and AI, in fact, I heard one famous publisher said that he wants to use ChatGPT to publish 1,000 books this year, or maybe 10,000, I forget. But some people are using that. But AI is never going to replace humans in terms of creativity. It is a tool that we can use. And if we can learn to use it well, then we can be even more creative than we were without it. So many people might be getting discouraged about that, but I encourage you to look for the positive sides of that. So I hope you will find, I hope that, I guess, a lot of my selfish talk today about my own background and experiences, I hope that you can find something in there that was inspiring to you, that you can relate to your own experience about encountering different ideas and cultures. Or if you were to write a story, what kind of story you would want to tell based on your background. And then you can bring that to your own creation, and you can bring it to reading and enjoying the stories of others. Hopefully that will help you. So thank you. I will take any questions you may have. And yeah, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat and I'd be happy to answer those.
Yes, anyone? I do hope that you can use this opportunity to ask questions to Mr. Travis. I do have one question, Mr. Travis. I'm not too proud to say that I do have one novel, a Malay novel.
Oh.
And I asked an experienced writer to, read and give her comments to me. And she said it's too typical. Okay, it's actually basically about love. Okay, and it's very popular here in Malaysia. So it's always about one man being chased by two women. One is the wife and another one is the scandal lah. Okay, that's typical in Malaysia. And she said it's best if I can try to have something else. So how do you want to sell your books, but at the same time you want to meet the what the market wants.
Yes.
That's my question.
Well, I could do a whole nother 2 to 3 hours about how to market books. But I think that's an excellent point. Writing the book, producing the story is only part of it. Then you have to get it into the hands of readers. But with romance books in particular, love stories, at least in the English-speaking world, they dominate Amazon. Almost half of the top books are all romance stories. But readers like the same kind of stories over and over with a different kind of twist. So I don't think you shouldn't worry about being too typical, but try to find a way that, what makes your book unique, but at the same time, also telling the reader that this is like many other books you like. So we know you like, I know you probably like this pattern of stories. I'm going to give you this pattern of story, but with.
Yeah, okay.
I don't think, I haven't read it, but I don't think you need to change your story. But I think also going back, especially to the idea of creating in the time of AI, there's going to be a lot of creation. And so we need to figure out a way to stand out as people,
Yeah.
to be not just the book, but to be the author. So
Right.
now, at the very last slide, I shared my website, and my blog is not very active. I'm publishing more lately about the scholarship blog, so that has kept me busy. But being present, showing kind of your life too as a writer, and not just why people are engaged in your characters that you write, but you as an author. And if you can create a connection with your readers, I think that will certainly help.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Travis. Okay, I will continue to make changes. I've stopped writing that novel, but I will continue. Thank you very much. And we do have one question from Siti Nurain. Since you are in Japan, did you plan to travel again? And what could be the country that you'd like to visit in the future?
Oh, I definitely plan to travel again. There are many, many places that I want to visit still. I would love to go back to Malaysia as a tourist instead of just going to attend a conference in Kuala Lumpur and see nothing else. One of my friends from graduate school, actually the friend who introduced me to my wife when we were all in graduate school together, is living and working in Malaysia now. So I would love to go back there and see more of your beautiful country.
Yes, yes.
But
Well,
also, I've actually, many Americans travel to Europe primarily, but I have not been to very many places in Europe. And since I studied history, there are several countries there I would like to go as well.
all right.
But I mentioned earlier, I have 3 small children, so right now it's somewhat difficult to travel.
Yes, yes. I couldn't agree more, Mr. Travis. Okay, thank you very much for the answers. So I hope, Siti Norain, you are satisfied. So any other questions that you would like to ask Mr. Travis? Okay. Thank you. Okay. Puan Shazliati, is there anything that you would like to say? Okay, wait a minute. Let me unmute you. Puan Shazliati, anything that you would like to say to Mr. Travis?
Hello, hi. Hi, Travis. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes. I'm so glad to be able to say something here. Due to we're not sure what happened actually. Yeah, but yes, thank you, Travis, for spending your precious 2 hours with us. It's not even 2 hours. I think we can have more time with you. I think the students have managed to learn so much from you, and not just the students. I think the lecturers or who have joined me for this session, Puan Asni, and we also have Puan Rebecca and also Puan Shakila. I think we have really enjoyed and learned so much because you're sharing from the heart, okay, as a writer. So that's really, really, wonderful for us. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it very much. And I also want to say thank you to everybody who's sending messages in the chat as well. Thank you all for spending your afternoon with me. I appreciate it very much, and thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, I think with that, is there any more question in the chat box, Mr. Travis? I don't think that is right. Everybody is basically saying, yeah, basically they are saying thank you. So again, from me also, thank you very much, Mr. Travis, and I do apologize for all the problems that we had during the session. Thank you very much for everything that you have shared. I really liked it, and I do hope that we can have more sessions like this. If not online, physical would be better. Physical meeting like this.
I would love to come to visit you in person. Yeah.
All right. So with that, I think that will be all for today. Thank you very much, and have a good day, Mr. Travis.
Thank you. You too.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye,
Assalamualaikum.
Travis. Waalaikumsalam.
Okay, Mr. Travis. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you. Shall I close out now?
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
All right,
Have
thank
a
you.
great day. Goodbye.